Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Prescott Herzog, and I'm a government and history major here from Claremont, New Hampshire. And I recently just finished my tenure as the president of the New Hampshire College Democrats and the Dartmouth Democrats. The Dartmouth Democrats and the Dartmouth Law Journal are thrilled to be co-sponsoring this event with the Rockefeller Center today. We are truly honored to be joined by Senator Peter Welch and Neal Katyal, class of 1991, and are very grateful to have Dafna Linzer here to moderate this conversation. This program is being presented as the Rockefeller Center's Roger S. Aaron 64 Lecture, established in honor of Roger S. Aaron 64, Esquire, in 1996, from gifts from Dartmouth's Lawyers Association, supporting the study of the role of law and justice, ethics, and public policy in the lives of individuals and society. As a reminder, Dartmouth is committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent. With that, we ask you do not interfere or disrupt today's program, which would include preventing attendees from seeing or hearing our guest and moderator, or interfering with our guests and moderators' ability to speak or be heard. Our moderator, Dafna Linzer, is an award-winning journalist and news executive who has reported around the world and broken some of the most definitive stories of our time. Linzer joined U.S. News and World Report in 2023 and is responsible for the editorial and business strategies that further engage consumers, increase synergy between editorial products, and elevate the company's brand. Dafna has worked as a foreign correspondent for the Associated Press, has covered national security for the Washington Post, was managing editor for NBC News and MSNBC, and was an executive editor at Politico. And now, a quick introduction of our speakers. Neal Katyal is a partner at the Washington, D.C. office of Milbank LLP and a member of the firm's litigation and arbitration group. Mr. Katyal, the former Acting Solicitor General of the United States, focuses on appellate and complex litigation. He's argued 52 cases before the Supreme Court of the United States. In the 2022-2023 Supreme Court term, he argued 5 separate cases, including winning the landmark voting case Moore v. Harper. From 2010 to 2011, Mr. Katyal served as the Acting Solicitor General of the United States. As Acting Solicitor General, he was responsible for representing the federal government of the United States in all appellate matters before the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals throughout the nation. After graduating from Yale Law School, Mr. Katyal clerked for the Honorable Guido Calisbri on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit and the Honorable Justice Stephen Breyer by the U.S. Supreme Court. Neal is a graduate of Yale Law School and Dartmouth College and was named a trustee of Dartmouth College in 2021. Senator Peter Welch has spent the bulk of his life working to improve the life of folks who often get left behind. After fighting housing discrimination in Chicago, he enrolled in law school at the University of California, Berkeley. He then settled in White River Junction, Vermont, where he worked as a public defender before founding a small law practice. Senator Welch was first elected to represent Windsor County in the Vermont Senate in 1980, and within 5 years, he was the first Democrat in Vermont history to hold the position of president pro tempore. In 2006, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he served for 16 years and then elected to the Senate in 2022. In the Senate, Senator Welch is focused on lowering costs for families, making Washington work better for Vermont, and protecting civil rights and democracy. The senator serves on the Judiciary Committee, the Finance Committee, the Agriculture Committee, and the Rules Committee. Please join me in warmly welcoming Senator Peter Welch, Neal Katyal, and Dafna Linzer.
You sit in the center.
Okay.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. Thank you for hosting a very important conversation. I know it'll be insightful at a very critical moment of change for the country. We're nearly at the halfway point of the president's first 100 days, usually an important marker that establishes the tone and direction of a new administration, but I think we got where we're headed now. This one has been moving at a dizzying pace. I want to begin with both of you, with you first, Senator. Just getting your perspectives on the spate of executive orders, many of which have already been challenged in court or appear to disregard congressional oversight powers. You're on the very powerful Judiciary Committee. Can you kick us off on what's been going on for 38 days?
The president has been on a lawless rampage. I mean, this is very serious, folks, what's happened, okay? We ran on the economy. We ran on the border. And what has happened is that the president has torn up the Constitution. Let me be specific. First of all, starting out with pardoning 1,600 people, many of whom committed violent acts against law enforcement officers in the Capitol. All right? How does that happen? One of the people who was pardoned had that dark website where he was selling drugs and doing sex porn, and where this guy had tried to hire somebody to kill another person, okay, pardoned. Number two, the president began invading congressional authority with his impoundment orders, okay? And what that is a central function of the legislative branch. And what the president is doing is totally disregarding the appropriations that were made and voted on by both Republicans and Democrats. And what you're seeing, which is very dangerous to me, is that many of my colleagues are acceding to that overreach. When Nixon tried to do it back when he was president, both the Republicans in Congress objected and resisted and succeeded, and the Supreme Court also assisted and succeeded. Then you have, and we'll talk a little bit about what the impoundment has really done and is threatening to institutions like Dartmouth. But then what we saw yesterday, that spectacle, was absolutely shocking to me. All right, we have an alliance with Ukraine. We're supporting them along with our NATO allies. I was with a group of senators just before Zelensky went to the White House ambush. Zelensky was speaking to a bipartisan group. There's been solid support for the U.S. continuing to do our share to help them against the aggression of Russia. And in that meeting, Zelensky was engaged, he was responsive, he was direct, and he was extremely grateful, he expressed, to the United States of America for all we've done. He also was very deferential to President Trump. He understood he had to go over there, they were going to sign this minerals deal. And he walks across the street and we all saw what happened. So I am in a position of observation here where I've seen nothing ever like this, where you've got the president basically running roughshod over congressional authority, and where you have an acquiescence on the part of many of my colleagues that he's invading the separate and co-equal function of Congress. And then you have the threats from the vice president that if the court makes an order that the president doesn't like, let them enforce it. So this is very serious, and I will also talk about what the day-to-day consequences are on the economy and on institutions like Dartmouth.
Really appreciate that. It's a privilege to be able to have that kind of insight and to hear a little bit that sort of behind the curtain of a meeting that takes place beforehand, that's bipartisan, that's across the street from the White House, that preceded what we all watched on television yesterday from the Oval Office. And of course, President Zelensky didn't sign that mineral deal that he had thought he was going over there to do, probably a consequence of the tone of that meeting. Neal, can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges? You challenged one of the most contentious executive orders, Trump's first term, right out of the gate. For those of you who, I'm sure many of you remember, what was often referred to colloquially as a Muslim ban that seemed designed to prevent people from entering the country based on their faith. You racked up enough wins in lower courts to force the administration to change the language over and over and over again until the final version was ultimately approved and remained on the books until you left office. You've got a case that you're about to take on in court now. Can you talk a little bit about that, and also just generally, is there a different playbook here from Trump this time on executive orders, and should there be a different playbook from everyone else here?
Okay, that's a lot. So first of all, thank you all for being here on a Saturday afternoon, talking about important ideas, like quaint ideas like the Constitution, the rule of law, that kind of stuff. And Senator, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Dartmouth. The senator and I met. We were at a mutual friend of ours from the Grateful Dead was having a party, and we met there. And the senator told me that he lives a couple miles from Dartmouth in Norwich, and I said, "Oh well, we've got to get you to talk to our students." And so, thank you for being here. So in the first administration, I did challenge the Muslim ban. Right, basically within the first week, Trump on that Friday night issued the order. We went into court, got the first one enjoined. Trump freaked out. He said, "This is a so-called judge. See you in court." We said, "We're ready." But then he pulled back that Muslim ban and replaced it with another one, which he said was better. The new one was better because it included, the first one had 7 countries that were overwhelmingly Muslim, between 90.9% and 99.9% Muslim. So the second time around, he added one country to the list, Chad, which I think he thought was some guy, and then said, well, now it includes a country that's only 50% Muslim. We went into court, got that one enjoined as well, and stopped that from going on. He freaked out, said, see you in the Supreme Court. We briefed the case, went to the Supreme Court. 2 weeks before the argument, he got scared, pulled it back, and then issued Travel Ban 3. Travel Ban 3 was different than Travel Ban 2 because it included 2 more new countries. It included North Korea, because you all know we have a very serious immigration problem with North Korea. And it included 100 officials in the Venezuelan travel office. Not clear any of them ever wanted to be in the United States or visit the United States anyway. But this allowed his Solicitor General to say, see, now it includes many other countries. And in that one, he did win 5-4 in the Supreme Court in, I think, a decision that will go down as one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in American history. But it did. Now, that playbook is, I think, relevant as we think about today. Trump has issued over 70 executive orders in the last 36 days. There's nothing wrong with an executive order. Presidents from time immemorial have done that. You know, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation is effectively an executive order. Biden issued 40 or so in his first 100 days. So there's nothing problematic about the concept. The question is, what is the substance of the executive order? What does it say? And the question that Dafna is asking about is the case that we're arguing on Monday, which is Trump is asserting by dint of the Constitution that he can fire any executive branch official, including Senate-confirmed agency heads. So my case involves the Merit Systems Protection Board, which was set up really in the 1880s and then revised in 1978 to basically adjudicate all disputes of federal employees. And it's a 3-member commission. Congress set it up and they said no more than 2 can ever be from the same political party. The whole idea is to create a bipartisan commission to try and solve these really difficult, thorny cases. And the federal government has other structures like this as well. The Federal Reserve Board, same kind of thing. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission. They're all set up in this way. Now, the Supreme Court in a case in 1935 called Humphrey's Executor, a really landmark case, said the Federal Trade Commission is constitutional and that a president can't just fire a member of that commission without reason, because Congress put in what we call for-cause protection. That means you can't fire someone without good cause. And that means something very specific. It means corruption or serious malfeasance in office. And all of those commissions that I mentioned to you, including the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Federal Reserve, they all have these kinds of for-cause protections in them. So what has Trump's acting Solicitor General done? She's gone to the Supreme Court and said, I want to overrule this landmark 1935 case, Humphrey's Executor. I think presidents have unlimited control over federal agencies, even ones Congress sets up that are intentionally designed to be bipartisan and intentionally designed to be insulated from presidential removal through the for-cause provisions. She said, the president is saying through the Solicitor General, no, that isn't true. The Constitution trumps that. Now, you never, of course, heard this when Biden was president. You never heard Trump or the Republicans saying, oh, Biden should be able to fire executive branch heads. It's only a theory they've concocted now that they're in power. So on Monday, we will argue, basically, those of you who are familiar with the legal system, stare decisis, the role of precedent, the idea that you don't overrule landmark precedents on which social expectations, government processes have crystallized around. I'm not going to predict what the courts will do, but I am very confident in the strength of our legal arguments. And, we can talk more about the role of the courts generally, but specifically, we will see that case first hit the courts on the trial court on Monday, and then in short order, we'll go to the Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, our nation's second highest court, and then to the Supreme Court.
That's great. I should say I received a bunch of fantastic student questions. I think I was meant to wait till the end and just add a few, but they're actually so good that I just put them all in. So I'm going to just take a few for both of you on behalf of students, really on behalf of everyone. They're so good. This one, I think, relates a little bit to what Neal was just saying, but as a question for both of you. With President Trump's Solicitor General nominee saying at his confirmation hearing that he would not rule out ignoring Supreme Court decisions in extreme cases. And Senator, you mentioned, what if the president decides not to comply with a court order? How confident are you, this question asks, that all Supreme Court rulings will be followed by President Trump in his second term? And what implications does this have if he does not?
Well, I'm not at all confident that it'll follow him. I mean, they've been very explicit. And, Trump, in an offhanded way, that's how he starts socializing what it is he's actually going to do. So he's got J.D. Vance saying, let the court enforce it. He's also said, as you've seen, that if he does something as president to save the country, it is by definition right. Okay, that's pretty scary. So if he does violate that, we're in a constitutional crisis. What that means is anybody's guess. We haven't been there before. Brown v. Board of Education, think about that. And what an incredibly disruptive decision that was. When we look back, we're all so proud of it. But the executive enforced it. And we don't have that confidence at all. And just going back to that, because I was in his confirmation hearing, this is a very, very smart lawyer. I don't know if you know him, so you probably do. But the basic question was, does the president have to comply with a court order? And his answer was pretty much what Dafna said. But all of the Justice Department people who've come through, Kash Patel, Pam Bondi, on the question of who won the 2020 election, they gave the scripted answer that President Biden was president, all right? And what that was really indicating is that they had to take an oath of allegiance to the president before they even got to the opportunity to take an oath after they were confirmed to the Constitution. That's a very ominous situation for me because all of the folks that are on there are basically not being willing to repudiate the Stop the Steal narrative. And that narrative that the president is still persisting on is his justification for the actions he's taken, including disregarding congressional law.
And I would say, like, the enforcement of federal court orders, and that's always been an issue in our republic. I mean, Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers in Federalist 78 says the courts are the least dangerous branch. Part of his reasoning is because courts don't have an enforcement authority on their own. They rely on legitimacy of their decision-making processes and ultimately the substance of the decisions themselves. Alexander Bickel, which writes the most important book in 20th century constitutional law, it's called The Least Dangerous Branch. That's the argument of the book, that we should fear them less because of that. And Andrew Jackson, when he was president, said Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. So that's the closest precedent to what you have here. I'm certainly not aware of any of my predecessors as Solicitor General or Attorneys General ever saying anything like what we started to hear in these confirmation hearings that Dafna and the Senator have referred to. If it does happen, it will be an enormously dangerous thing. There is a statute that requires marshals to enforce federal court orders. And so there is an argument that the president, that there's an independent enforcement authority apart from the executive branch. Normally the executive branch, the first lines of Article 2 of our Constitution is the executive power shall be vested in a president, and that the president, later it says, shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So generally our structure is law enforcement is something done by the executive branch. But here you do have a congressional statute that says the marshals, which are part of the judicial branch, are to enforce court orders. So practically what that means is you could imagine a circumstance in which the marshals themselves try to enforce court orders. So if you think back to, the Senator referred to desegregation. one of the most powerful moments in the last 100 years of our country is a rule of law. The court issues Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. There's resistance in many places, including Little Rock. And the school in Little Rock is refusing to implement the desegregation orders. And the president orders U.S. Marshals and others to go and escort this woman, the little girls, into Little Rock. So if the president doesn't issue such an order today, maybe the marshals will take that role on themselves. But that's a pretty difficult, it's a slender reed on which to pin our hopes.
You mentioned, both of you, that you, Senator, first, that the pardons of those who were convicted after January 6th, but it's more than that, right? I mean, I think the new leadership in the Justice Department, folks, prosecutors, leadership who were involved in the prosecutions of January 6th case have in some cases been demoted, have been fired. Right. Other folks in leadership in the Justice Department. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Did that come up in the nomination process? What would be consequences here that folks who've been confirmed would take once?
Well, let's talk about Kash Patel at the FBI. The question was asked of him: will there be a purge at the FBI? And by the way, at the FBI, everybody's non-political, in the sense that they don't get their job through politics. And, I was a public defender, and the cases I got were assigned to me. I had nothing to do with deciding whether I was going to represent a person. The judge would tell me. All the FBI agents, the cases they get are assigned to them. They have nothing to do with the decision whether they are going to work on a January 6th case or not. So you've got people showing up for work. Their superior says, Peter, here's your case today. It might be a January 6th case. What's happening in the FBI now is they're getting all the information about everybody who worked on a January 6th case, and those people are all in jeopardy of being fired, and some of them have been. In the confirmation hearing, we asked Kash Patel, will there be retribution, or is anything going to happen to the folks who worked on these cases? He denied there would be. Everybody will be on the merits, and he doesn't know anything about it. It came out in some really good reporting 2 days after he was voted out of committee. It was a party line vote. That he not only was wrong telling us he didn't know about it, he was managing it, okay? He was doing the whole implementation. So this is obviously very worrisome because you've got to keep politics out of the justice system. And there's been a huge argument about that, but this is actually what is happening now, and that's happening in the Justice Department as well.
Yeah, just to pick one example, just 2 days ago, the U.S. Attorney's Office for D.C., that's the top prosecutor's office for D.C. There's 94 of these offices across the country. There's, one in Boston and one in New York, or a few in New York and so on. But there's one in D.C. It's the nation's largest prosecutorial office. It has about 600 attorneys working there. And Trump's top prosecutor basically fired the top 7, or moved the top 7 people, all of whom had done January 6th prosecutions, but also like all sorts of other prosecutions on terrorism and keeping DC safe and the like, and reassign them all to misdemeanors, like petty crimes. I mean, you take the most experienced people, and then you take them, just because they did January 6th cases, many of them were assigned to it, they then get removed from their posts, the posts that they've had for years, sometimes decades, all that experience, and move them to misdemeanors. And by the way, go so far as to say that their parking privileges are taken away as well in the order. So sometimes the cruelty is the point, and other times retribution is the point.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit actually about the role of the special counsel that I know you were so involved in creating, just because of what has happened, I think, with Jack Smith and the team that was investigating President Trump when he was out of office for January 6th and other issues?
Yeah, so I mean, One of the things about our constitutional system that's hard for people to get their minds around is what I was saying about the president's take care power. The president controls law enforcement in our system and constitutionally. Congress doesn't, the courts don't. It's really the president. And what that means practically is that when the president is being the one is the one who's the target of an investigation, the president can order the prosecution to be stopped. And when you have a president of the other party, like we had over the last 4 years, if they launch an investigation, it's against a rival political figure, it's automatically seen as political because, well, it's Biden who's prosecuting Trump. This so-called is the narrative. So maybe 25 years ago, I was a young Justice Department staffer, and we were wrestling with these problems, and I was tasked with trying to resolve them. We had something called the Independent Counsel Act at the time, which gave Ken Starr his powers, gave Lawrence Walsh his powers over Iran-Contra. Nobody thought that was constitutional in the end, that because it was creating a headless fourth branch prosecutor that was not able to be supervised by any political official, that was problematic. So we settled on something else, a special counsel in which the Attorney General would look to appoint someone outside the Justice Department, outside the normal chain of command, give that person to day-to-day responsibilities for the investigation, but ultimately, even there, could be overruled by the Attorney General. And that's kind of the system that we've used for the last 20 years. It's worked quite well. The Attorneys General don't go and talk to the presidents about investigations. There are very serious norms against that. All of that is now blown out of the water. And you can expect that the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General are fully in consultation with the President about any potential investigations in which he or people close to him will be a target. There isn't a way to solve that problem, really, outside of a constitutional amendment. Congress could use its impeachment powers. That's the only other thing. But remember, impeachment requires a 2/3 vote in the Senate for a conviction, and 2/3 of the Senate can't agree, I think, on anything these days. So as a practical matter, that doesn't really work. Now what Trump has done is go so far as to say that Jack Smith, the special prosecutor, under those regulations, he's a threat to the republic, and his security clearances should be stripped, and they should investigate him. And again, there isn't really a direct remedy against that, except for Smith to know that at the end of the day, he presumably did everything right and will survive an investigation. It'll cost a lot to be the target of an investigation. And this is something you always have to worry about is, okay, yes, you'll be exonerated in the end, but in the process, they're going to ruin your financial situation. So what happened with Jack Smith? He asked Covington and Burling, a very respected DC law firm, to represent him pro bono. What did Trump do? He then ordered an investigation of Covington and Burling and to take away any federal contracts that they may have.
Unprecedented, we should say, to go after a law firm like that in an executive order.
Yeah, I mean, when I was doing the Guantanamo cases back in 2005, there was a Pentagon official who threatened to go after law firms that were representing Guantanamo detainees. That was blown out of the water, and he lost his job. Now I think that guy would get promoted for such a thing.
So some of the legal challenges that have already gone to have already been filed are really aimed at the work of Elon Musk's efforts to dismantle or shrink federal institutions. I want to talk about the impact of some of those moves of Senator, but also just about transparency generally. And does Congress have a real sense of what's going on? I feel like in the early days of the administration, there were scenes of members of Congress, senators going to USAID, for example, asking to see what was going on inside, going to the Treasury Department, being barred from entry. Do you have a sense of what's happening with Elon Musk and his teams?
Yeah, I do. He's killing agencies and causing a lot of harm to a lot of people. The reality here is that Trump has a cabinet of one. Musk is in charge. The heads of other agencies are having to accommodate him and his Doge team. And they're making decisions about terminating people in these agencies. And, just step back a second. There was a big attack on waste, fraud, and abuse. So just to get a sense of where people stand, how many are in favor of waste, fraud, and abuse? Right? None of us are. But if you're serious, we've got a really good business school over here. If you're serious about dealing with waste, fraud, and abuse, you kick the tires to the agency that you're going to improve and figure out, all right, what's its function? What do we need in order to achieve that goal? What do we actually have? Where can we eliminate? And actually, in a serious inquiry, where do we actually need to put more resources? That's how you do it. What's happened with Doge is they've gone in and fired first. Their approach to saving is to maximize the body count. That's literally what it is. So it has nothing to do with trying to get functional improvement that you can get through a disciplined review of how it's going. The cruelty of this is astonishing. I mean, take USAID. That was an early target because a lot of folks don't know what USAID is. A lot of folks think it's 25% of our budget. It's less than 1%. And number one, you have the employees who've been there in many cases 10 or 15 or 20 years, having security people show up in Washington at their desk and telling them they have 15 minutes to remove their belongings, and they're escorted out of the building. I mean, just think about that, okay? Second, we're firing all these folks who work for USAID, like in Sudan. And some of them, their job is to get the food out of the warehouse to the children in the camps. They're fired. That food's going to rot. Those kids are going to starve. We've got vaccines that have made a huge difference. They're in refrigerated units. The people who take them from the refrigerated units to bring them to the camps to inject the folks who need it, fired. Vaccines are destroyed. Marco Rubio was my colleague, of course, in the Senate, now Secretary of State. He was a big promoter of USAID. He voted for many of these programs that Doge has now destroyed, okay? And this is going to be a subject to litigation. But just think of what happens even if the litigation is over and it turns out it was improper for Musk to do that. The infrastructure is gone. The people's lives are really kind of over. We can't put this back together. So that's what's going on. And there is no transparency except that he's doing it. And in the process of it, by the way, getting access to your personal information and mine at Treasury, your personal information and mine at Social Security. There is litigation. Neal, you might be able to talk about that. But this is where the shattering of norms has been so rampant with Trump as the president that he gets it, that he can shoot first and aim later. And the more, it's not about disruption, it's about destruction. So there's real damage being done to our institutions, and there's real harm to being done to people who've committed their lives to helping our country, and to a lot of folks who were receiving really life-saving help from our country.
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, I think the Senator is absolutely right. Nobody's against, cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. The question is who's doing the cutting and how are they doing it? Our Constitution's Appointments Clause says basically that you need, for these kinds of decisions, a presidentially nominated Senate-confirmed official. Nobody confirmed Elon Musk to this kind of thing. Like this, the Silicon Valley mantra, move fast, break things, it works for a startup. Because if a startup fails, like who loses money? A bunch of rich investors, okay? That's it. Maybe a few people lose their jobs. If the United States is treated like a startup and fails, the consequences are catastrophic, which is why you don't act that way, why our founders insisted on such a prudential view of governance in which change happens slowly. And there's all sorts of barriers to prevent this kind of rapid government action. when I was in the federal government, being a top lawyer for the federal government, I had access to the entire resources, all the expertise of federal agencies and all these people. And it is the most amazing and inspiring thing you see. Because whether it's, the patentability of BRCA1 gene, and there's, 500 experts at NIH thinking about that, or whether it's, this little tree bark and how it might actually be a life-saving drug, or, economic policy or whatever, you've got this reservoirs of expertise that have been built up over generations. And these people don't make a lot of money, and they're in it for the public good, and they're not political. As far as I could tell, I never had anyone in the career offices like all these experts act in a political way. They were just good at their job. They're now all being fired, or their lives are made so difficult to do their job that they're leaving. And that is catastrophic. Now, yes, there are lawsuits, particularly against Doge, that might be successful because they've rushed to set this up in an improper way. And as the senator says, the transparency around this stuff is ridiculous. I mean, one of the main people was 19 years old, and I think goes by some moniker that I can't really say in public. So, I do think that there's, some constitutional and other issues. We didn't even know who was running Doge until recently, when it turned out that it was, they released the name of Amy Gleason to be running that. But that, that's obviously not the way government works. You're supposed to know the transparency is really important so that the voters can know what's going on. So lots of problems legally. But at the end of the day, it's not just a legal problem, it's a kind of policy problem that you have these kinds of decisions being made in this way.
And for you, when you talked about waste, fraud, and abuse, getting rid of the inspectors general, I think that was their job, right?
It was, Congress set up inspector generals, and that was about waste, fraud, and abuse. And actually, my colleague, Senator Grassley from Iowa, a conservative Republican, but a real stickler about he's furious about waste, fraud, and abuse. I mean, he's as cheap as Vermonters are, okay? and it was a little sad to me because this was, all of us supported him in this effort to have inspector generals. So there's a reason Trump fired them first, because they actually were going to be looking under the hood and giving us information. That's more litigation, right, about his ability to do that. But it's not on, this is the thing, it's not on the level. We had this election, and if you step back, it was close, but it was a definitive victory by President Trump. And, as a Democrat who was disappointed that we lost, I also have to acknowledge that we didn't connect on certain things that President Trump did. He tapped into the frustration everyday people have about figuring out how to pay their bills, and also the border was a big issue. But what's happened since then is that he's done nothing that is instrumental in the economy. These tariffs that are going to go into effect with Mexico and Canada, that's going to hurt us right away. Energy costs. My wife's on the Public Utility Commissioner. We import a lot of power from Canada. Those rates are going to be going up on our electric utility bills. Farmers are going to pay 25% more for their feed. Okay, and then the myth of Trump is that those will be paid by Mexico and Canada. Well, they're going to be paid by you and me. We know that. I think the economy is going to continue to deteriorate because it can't handle this kind of instability and policy volatility. And we're going to get back to that. But what are the two things that I think we have to do is start helping people see the reality of what is happening. And I think it's not about waste, fraud, and abuse. That's the cover. It's really about dismantling the institutions. And what's so worrisome to me, our democracy is being threatened. You have to have checks and balances. You have to have an independent Supreme Court. You have to have a Congress that asserts its authority to play its role as a check on the executive. And that was the insight of our founders when we went from having a king rule us to having a democracy. And it's messy and it's difficult, but that competition of power is essential to maintain some stability while we navigate the extraordinary challenges that a country faces over 250 years. And he's destroying those institutions. And along the way, he's destroying these institutions like the CDC, like the FDA. I mean, these things that always need improvement. But it's so profoundly radical as opposed to conservative. You know, when I got in politics in Vermont, I met all these Republicans that I really admired because they were small government, low taxes. Everybody likes that. And personal responsibility. But that personal responsibility included your obligation to help make an institution better. And that institution could be the local volunteer fire department. It might be the community bank. It might be the church. But there was a humility that went along with that, where you were understanding that as an individual agent, you had responsibility for yourself, but you had to have institutions that were going to carry on the values you thought were so important. That's all out the window now.
I mean, it's amazing we're more than a half hour into this discussion, and only now has Congress come up as a potential check. And that's because it's not one. And it's so different than the way our founders thought about the architecture of our government. They thought of separation of powers, but they didn't anticipate political parties. And it's really separation of parties now that is the check, often not of the branches of government or of states. We can talk about states as something of a check and federalism, but it's a weak one. And so, you know, when you have both houses of Congress with the same political party as the president, you generally have weaker checks. And here you effectively have none. I mean, as best as I can tell, your colleagues have totally abandoned their role as a check on the president.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. And so what do we use for checks now? What's the biggest check on Trump? It's probably the stock market. It's probably when the market goes down, then, I mean, he'll try and blame DEI for the market going down, but, you know, at the end of the day, it's going to be his decisions. And, you know, maybe that will provide a check, but we can't rely on Congress. We can only sometimes rely on the courts. I can talk about why if you want, but you know, that's why we're left in the situation we're in.
I think I'd ask you to talk about that, because people are losing faith in courts. And also just talk about what you think the impact of the immunity decision from the Supreme Court will have in the second term.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a view that the court is basically in Trump's pocket now, or things like that. I disagree with that. I mean, that this is a court that in 2020, for example, ruled against Trump many times on all those crazy election cases he brought. They were crazy, so I don't want to put too much emphasis on it. But you know, it ruled against Trump on executive power 8-1 when the January 6th executive privilege, when the January 6th Commission tried to get access to those records. He lost 8-1, only Clarence Thomas dissenting. In the case that the introducers mentioned, about that I argued a couple years ago, Moore versus Harper, a big case about elections. They ruled against the Republican National Committee 6-3. So they are capable, certainly, of being a check. To me, the issue is not as much about the personnel of the court as just the limited role of courts in our system. Our founders didn't think the courts were going to play the major checking role. They thought that was Congress or sometimes the states. And so it means there's all sorts of limits on judicial power. They can't, first of all, just go and declare something unconstitutional. There has to be a concrete case and controversy, and you've got to have legal standing, the ability to come in and say I was injured. And then there's all sorts of deference to the executive. That's why we lost the Muslim ban case. Deference to the president's determination of national security decision making. So you have a whole bunch of things designed to keep courts in a certain role. And much of what Trump is doing is so boneheaded and ridiculous, but it's not illegal. Because there's a big distinction. A lot of times you can have something that's unconstitutional, but a really good idea, and vice versa. You can have something that's a really bad idea, but it's constitutional. And that's my fear about the courts. It's not as much about, you know, this Chief Justice or that justice as it is about just how much of a role they can play.
I want to ask a question from one of the students, and it has a lot to do with what you were talking about earlier, Senator, especially when you mentioned your colleague, Senator Grassley, his feelings about inspectors general and all of your support of that. You and I had breakfast in Washington with some of your Republican colleagues right before inauguration, and there was a real attempt in that moment to find bipartisan agreement on issues, especially, as you said, it related to the economy. Do you feel now, kind of almost 40 days in, that there are areas of bipartisan agreement right now that you can point to?
First of all, I believe that it's really important in life and in politics to reach out to people you don't necessarily agree with. Because that, in my assumption in politics from being in the state Senate, Margaret was in the state House, is that the folks who are there, regardless of party, have the same motivation you do. You want to try to make Vermont a better state. You want to make our country a better state or better country if you're in the U.S. Senate. So that's sort of the operating premise. There's a reality of political forces that apply to me, but are much fiercer to my Republican colleagues. Like, when we met with President Zelensky just 2 days ago, there were real Republican champions of Ukraine in there, all right? Trump does what he does, and they face fierce political headwinds at home if they are seen as being contradicting Trump. They also face the threat from Musk right now of millions of dollars going into a primary against them, okay? I don't face that, so it's easy for me to be preachy here, but I hope if I did face it, I'd do the right thing. I mean, that'd be my hope. But there really are structural issues out there, and it's what Neal was saying about the parties being as opposed to Congress, because that's where we've lost it. When just going back to that Nixon era, you remember there were Republicans who went to the president after the evidence became very clear that the crimes were committed and told him, you've got to resign, all right? That doesn't happen here. And you had the impoundment where there was an executive taking of congressional prerogative, and Republicans and Democrats protected the institution, and that doesn't apply now. And part of it is this totally corrupt campaign finance system we have. It's intensified by Musk, who spent $287 million on behalf of President Trump in his campaign. He's now spending millions of dollars in a Wisconsin Supreme Court election, and is threatening to go after senators who deviate from doctrine. So these are enormous, and then we've got all these gerrymandered districts where the folks who get elected are really kind of extreme on, particularly on the Republican side, but it's also true on our side as well. This gerrymandering is for the benefit of the politicians, not the voters. So there's some real structural issues that we need to address for the well-being of our democracy.
Let me mention here one case that I have that deals with what the senator's talking about. I've believed for a long time that Citizens United is part of why we are in the predicament we are in. Mm-hmm. That's the Supreme Court's 5-4 decision back 15 years ago that said corporations have free speech rights, and therefore they can give unlimited money in campaigns. That decision was bad enough on its own, but it was read by lower courts to include super PACs and dark money being spent by entities that we don't know for unlimited amounts, as long as they don't directly coordinate with a presidential campaign. So we went to Maine and got on the ballot in Maine, question 1, which passed by 74% of the vote in Maine, by 74% of Maine voters this past November. And that bans super PAC contributions of over $5,000 and requires disclosure of who is the actual the actual people funding the super PAC. That has been challenged as a violation of First Amendment rights, and so we are now defending that, and I'll argue it next month in Maine court, in the Maine federal court, and then we expect that to go up to the Supreme Court. But that's an example of where I think creative litigation strategies, can make a difference. People will look at the thing and say, oh, Citizens United meant all of this stuff. But actually, if you read it closely, you take the court at its word, you read it, then you can find gaps, and then you can challenge those gaps.
Well, God bless you for that, because that is so essential. By the way, this guy, 68 cases in the Supreme Court?
No, not yet. No.
How many, 62?
No, 52.
So, he's a slacker.
Slacker.
But I want to say on that Citizens United, it's heartbreaking for me. I ran for Congress in 2006. It was just before Citizens United, and it was the first time the seat had been open in Vermont, 16 years. And the Republicans had a tremendous candidate. She was our adjutant general, and of course it was Iraq War, and she was highly respected. In fact, I think the Democrats were trying to recruit her. She ran as a Republican. She and I got together and had a cup of coffee, and we talked about the campaign, and we both said to each other, you know what, we don't want to do negative ads. So we had a handshake, and we had no negative ads. And the Republican campaign committee and the Democratic campaign committee were saying, Peter, do negative ads. And they were saying the same thing to Martha. Neither of us did it. That's the last contested congressional race in our country without negative ads. Now, why? It's because when Martha and I sat down and made an agreement, we could enforce it because we had to raise our own money and we were responsible for how it was spent. Now, the super PACs look around the country. They don't care who is running. They're looking for where do we have a chance to pick up a seat so that the majority we want is going to be the majority. And then they spend way more than the candidates spend. So you'll see ads out there that make you sick, right? And the candidate often has nothing to do with it whatsoever. So the process has been hijacked. And that's my big lament, because literally the last negative-free campaign was here over there in Vermont.
The students must have figured out how this conversation was going to go, because one of the questions actually for Neal is, what else do you think might be headed to the court right now, and might we see a surprise decision from the court in the next couple of years?
You mean a good one?
I think we will get some good
they
ones.
They didn't say in the question.
Let me give you one that will, I think, it's a birthright citizenship. So Trump has said that if you are the child of immigrants in the United States, and even if you're on a student visa, that you don't get to be a U.S. citizen. Now, the opening words of the 14th Amendment are designed directly to address this. And they're designed to overrule the worst Supreme Court decision in American history, Dred Scott. And what they say is that if you are born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. Now, it has the word subject to the jurisdiction thereof, which Trump's lawyers are saying, well, if you're here illegally, you're not subject to the jurisdiction thereof, which is a crazy argument because, of course, if you're an illegal person, illegal alien, and you commit some sort of crime, you're subject to the jurisdiction, of course. And I thought that's what Trump ran on, frankly. So I think it's a very weak argument. It's already been litigated in trial court in front of a Reagan-appointed judge, Judge Kuhnhauer, who said, this is the most unconstitutional thing I've seen in my life, basically. So it'll go up to the Court of Appeals and then to the Supreme Court, but I think that Trump will lose that case, and he will lose other cases. The problem is not just, as I was saying before, the limited role of federal courts, but the fact that Trump is trying to flood the zone, both as our in the policy world, foreign and domestic, as well as the courts. He's throwing so much stuff at our minds, at our courts, our judges. Not all of it can be stopped, even if the courts are performing their role vigorously. And so that's why, at the end of the day, it's elections that matter more so than these other checks.
Great, thank you.
With that, we have to sum up the talk, but I want to please welcome everybody to thank our guests tonight, Neal Katyal, Senator Welch, Dafna Linzer, thank you so much for joining us in this incredible conversation. And thank you to the Dartmouth Democrats and the Dartmouth Law Journal, student organizations who helped bring this program to fruition. Thank you all so much.